Imagine this. You are 19 years old. The world around you is burning. Your unit is shattered. Your friends are either dead or retreating, and the enemy, hundreds of them, are advancing with machine guns, mortars, and tanks. And yet, in that moment, you do not run. You turn to fight, alone. This is the story of one young American soldier who stood against impossible odds, holding off 250 German soldiers for more than an hour. A stand so defiant, so unthinkable, that even the Germans themselves were left in shock. His name was Private First Class Silvestre Herrera. He wasn't sat just fighting for survival. He was fighting for his brothers in arms, for his unit, and for something larger. The idea that courage, even in the darkest hour, can change the course of battle. But before we understand how one man held off 250,000 enemies, we must step back into the crucible of World War II, into the freezing chaos of 1945, when the German war machine, though wounded, was far from finished. This is not just a tale of strategy or weapons. It is a story of raw humanity, of fear and defiance, of a single soldier whose courage became legend. By the spring of 1945, the Second World War had raged for nearly 6 years. Nazi Germany was cornered. To the east, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly toward Berlin. To the west, American, British, and French forces pressed through France into Germany itself. Hitler's Reich was collapsing, but it was not yet defeated. The winter of 1944-45 had seen Hitler's last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate, ferocious counterattack through the Ardennes that stunned the Allies but ultimately failed. That failure cost Germany tens of thousands of men and tanks, yet despite being bloodied and exhausted, German soldiers fought on with grim determination. Every hill, every town, every river crossing became a battlefield. For the American GIs on the front lines, it was a grinding war of attrition. One village secured might be lost the next day. Convoys were ambushed, patrols disappeared in forests. Morale was stretched thin, and yet the orders remained: advance, push into Germany, break the Nazi war machine for good. Among those soldiers was a young man named Silvestre Herrera. Born in Mexico, raised in the United States, he was not even an American citizen when he was drafted into the US Army. His life had been simple: work, family, dreams of a modest future. But the war pulled him across the ocean, into a frozen hellscape of forests and battlefields. Herrera, like so many others, had never asked to be a hero, but history has a way of choosing its champions. In March of 1945, Herrera's unit, the 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division, was pushing into German territory. The mission was straightforward but perilous: clear enemy strongpoints, secure vital ground, and keep the offensive moving. But no plan survives contact with the enemy. What began as another dangerous patrol would soon explode into a desperate stand, one that would etch Herrera's name into the annals of courage. The Germans were waiting, and they were far more numerous than anyone expected. To understand what happened that day, we must look not at the divisions on a map, but at the men themselves, young, weary, far from home. Each of them carried more than a rifle. They carried letters folded into their pockets, photographs of sweethearts, tokens from family. They carried memories of home that felt like another world. Private First Class Silvestre Herrera was one of them. Born in Camargo, Chihuahua, Mexico, he was just a boy when his family brought him to the United States. Growing up in Arizona, he lived a modest life, working on farms, supporting his family. By all accounts, Herrera was quiet, unassuming, hardly the figure one imagines as the centerpiece of a legend. When the draft notice arrived, Herrera didn't question it. He went where he was ordered, alongside thousands of other young men. But unlike most of them, Herrera had a secret. He was not a US citizen. In fact, he didn't even know it until after he was drafted. A cruel irony of war, fighting, bleeding, and possibly dying for a country that by law did not yet claim him as its own. Yet, in the foxholes and the frozen fields of Europe, citizenship meant little. What mattered was the man to your left and the man to your right, brotherhood forged in fire. Herrera's comrades weren't thinking of his birth certificate. They were thinking of his courage, his steady presence, his loyalty. By March 15, 1945, Herrera's platoon had been ordered into a dense forest near the German border. Intelligence suggested enemy resistance, but the details were vague. Patrols often were. The soldiers marched cautiously, rifles at the ready, hearts pounding with the familiar dread that at any moment the quiet could shatter into chaos. For Herrera and his fellow infantrymen, the human stake was simple and brutal. Survive, protect each other, and push forward. None of them could have imagined that within hours, the fate of the entire platoon would rest on the shoulders of one man alone. And then, the forest erupted. It happened without warning. One moment, Herrera's platoon was advancing cautiously through the thick German woods. The next, the air was alive with gunfire. The rattle of MG-42 machine guns shredded the silence, bullets snapping branches, ripping bark from trees. Mortar shells exploded overhead, showering dirt and smoke. The Germans had been waiting. Outnumbered, outgunned. The Americans found themselves pinned down. Roughly 250 German soldiers, seasoned defenders, dug in and supported by heavy weapons, were now bearing down on Herrera's unit. For the young infantrymen of the 142nd Regiment, the situation was dire. Their line could break at any moment. Fear spread quickly. In war, the difference between holding your ground and collapsing into retreat is often razor-thin. Some soldiers clung to their rifles, returning fire desperately. Others froze, paralyzed by the storm of lead. Every second that passed brought the Germans closer. Herrera Seben's platoon leader shouted for his men to fall back, regroup, but retreating under fire is among the most dangerous maneuvers in battle. To move meant exposing yourself to machine gun fire. To stay meant certain destruction. Either way, dozens of lives now hung in the balance. It was in that moment that Herrera made a decision, not one born of calculation, but of instinct. He rose from cover, rifle in hand, grenade strapped to his chest, and he began to move toward the enemy. Every bullet seemed aimed at him. German gunners turned their fire toward the lone soldier charging across open ground. Yet somehow Herrera pressed on, throwing grenades, firing bursts, forcing the enemy to recoil. His audacity bought precious seconds for his comrades, seconds that meant survival.
In war, courage is contagious.
One man's defiance can steady an entire line, but Herrera's act was more than that. It was reckless, almost suicidal, and it was only the beginning. The forest was chaos. Herrera's charge had stunned the Germans for a moment, but moments in battle are fleeting. Soon the storm returned with greater fury. Mortar shells burst around him, machine gun fire laced the ground, and the overwhelming truth became clear. The Americans were still trapped, and the enemy was pressing closer. Herrera's platoon was bleeding. Men were down, pinned in shallow cover, unable to move. Ammunition was running low. Retreat had become impossible. The choice now was brutal. Fight to the last, or be overrun. Herrera could have stayed low, could have clung to survival, but again he rose. He pushed forward alone, crawling, then sprinting, weaving between trees as rounds tore into the ground around him. In his hands, grenades. In his heart, a determination to draw the enemy's fire away from his brothers. With terrifying precision, Herrera charged not once, but twice, each time lobbing grenades into German machine gun nests. Explosions ripped through enemy positions, scattering soldiers who moments earlier had commanded the battlefield. Herrera's single-handed assault silenced two guns that had pinned his platoon. But victory has its price. In the chaos, Herrera stepped into a minefield. The blast tore through his feet, mangling both legs. The pain was unimaginable. Blood soaked the frozen ground beneath him. Most men would have collapsed, screaming for medics. But Herrera kept fighting. On his knees, crawling, barely able to move, he fired his rifle, threw his last grenades, and shouted for his comrades to advance. Even crippled, even broken, Herrera refused to yield. In that moment, he was not fighting for himself. He was holding the line for everyone else. This was the breaking point. A man shattered, yet unbroken. Alone against hundreds, and still defiant. Herrera lay bleeding in the dirt. His legs were shattered, his body torn by shrapnel. By every measure, his fight should have ended there, yet what he had already done, charging enemy guns, silencing machine nests, forcing German soldiers into retreat, had bought his platoon the one thing they desperately needed: time. The Germans had expected an easy kill, a small platoon caught in the open, ripe for destruction. Instead, they were confronted by a fury they did not anticipate, one man charging them with reckless defiance, refusing to die quietly. The psychological impact was immediate. Confusion rippled through the German line. If one soldier fought with such desperation, how many more Americans were waiting in the trees? In war, morale is as powerful as firepower. Herrera's actions, though costing him nearly everything, reignited the spirit of his brothers in arms. Inspired by his sacrifice, the surviving men of the 142nd Infantry began to move. They returned fire with renewed ferocity. Squad leaders rallied their troops. Medics scrambled to drag the wounded back, and slowly, cautiously, the Americans began to advance. Herrera, dragging himself forward, continued to signal his comrades. Every bullet he fired, every grenade he hurled from his knees was a message: do not stop, do not surrender. His stand turned paralysis into momentum. The Germans, shocked by the audacity of a single defender, began to falter. Their advance slowed, their fire slackened. What had seemed inevitable, the crushing of an American platoon, now teetered on a knife-sep's edge. This was the turning point, not won by strategy or overwhelming firepower, but by the unyielding courage of one man who refused to let fear decide the outcome. But the battle was not over. The price was still to be paid, in blood, in lives, in the haunting cost of survival. With Herrera's defiant stand buying them precious time, the 142nd Infantry Regiment had a window, a narrow chance to survive what should have been annihilation. Their leaders seized it. Orders cut through the chaos: flank left, suppress the gunners, move forward. What had been panic moments earlier was now transformed into coordinated resistance. Herrera's grenades had shattered 2 key German machine gun nests. That left gaps in the enemy's curtain of fire. Squad leaders spotted the weakness and moved quickly. Riflemen poured rounds into exposed German positions, while BAR gunners laid down suppressing fire. Mortar crews adjusted their aim, dropping shells where Herrera's assault had forced the enemy back. Step by step, tree by tree, the platoon advanced. Wounded men were dragged to the rear, ammunition was redistributed, and every man who could still fight threw himself into the effort. The battlefield had shifted from desperate defense to cautious, determined offense. Through it all, Herrera continued to crawl, to fire, to signal. He was broken in body, yet unyielding in spirit. His determination became a rallying point, visible proof that surrender was not an option. The Germans, disciplined and deadly, were not routed easily, but the sudden reversal, the Americans advancing where they should have been crushed, forced hesitation, and hesitation on the battlefield is lethal. Once a force begins to doubt its advantage, momentum shifts. The platoon pressed forward, exploiting every weakness, until at last they reached a defensible position. What could have been a massacre was transformed into survival, and it all hinged on a single soldier's decision to stand when every instinct screamed to fall. But survival was not yet victory. The moment of reckoning was still ahead. The battle raged on. The Germans pressed with sheer numbers, determined to crush the pocket of resistance before it could regroup. Shouts in German echoed through the trees, followed by the thunder of machine guns and the blast of grenades. For the Americans, it was the razor's edge between survival and destruction. And then, something remarkable happened. The Germans, so confident of their advantage, began to falter. Their momentum broke. Every push they made was met with fierce return fire. Every machine gun nest they re-established was silenced by American rifles or grenades. What should have been overwhelming force now bled away into hesitation and retreat. The reason was clear. They had faced something they could not comprehend. A single man who refused to yield, who had already silenced 2 of their positions, and who, even with his body torn apart, continued to fight as though the outcome depended on him alone. To the Germans, it seemed madness. To the Americans, it was salvation. The platoon, seizing the moment, unleashed everything they had left. A final coordinated assault swept through the forest. Rifle fire crackled, grenades burst, and bayonets fixed as the men surged forward. The German line broke. One by one, their positions were abandoned. Smoke and silence replaced the roar of battle. When it was over, the field was littered with broken weapons, scattered helmets, and the fallen, German and American alike. But the platoon had survived. Against all odds, a handful of men had withstood and repelled more than 200 enemies. And at the heart of it lay Silvestre Herrera, broken in body, but unbroken in spirit. The Germans had come expecting to crush resistance. Instead, they withdrew in shock, stunned by the defiance of one soldier who refused to fall. When the gunfire faded, the forest fell eerily silent. The Americans, battered and bloodied, had survived the impossible, but survival had come at a price. Bodies were scattered across the battlefield. Wounded men cried out for help. Medics rushed forward, doing what they could with what little supplies they carried. At the center of it all was Private First Class Silvestre Herrera. Both of his feet had been destroyed by the mines. He had lost more blood than most men could endure. And yet, through his pain, his first words to the medics were not of himself. He urged them to care for others first. His life, he believed, was less important than those of his brothers in arms. Herrera's actions had saved countless lives that day. By silencing enemy machine guns and refusing to surrender, he had given his platoon the chance to regroup, fight back, and survive. For many of his comrades, their very existence after the war would be owed to the courage of one man who would not give in. Herrera was evacuated, his legs amputated below the knees. His war was over. But his story was not. Word of his heroism spread quickly through his unit, then up the chain of command, and finally across the nation. To those who had witnessed it, there was no doubt. Herrera had performed an act of extraordinary valor. In recognition of his sacrifice, Silvestre Herrera was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the United States. He became the first and only soldier in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor from the U.S. government and the Order of Military Merit from Mexico, a rare tribute to a man whose courage transcended borders. But medals, parades, and honors could never erase the memory of that day. The screams, the blood, the impossible burden of choosing to stand alone. For Herrera and his comrades, the true aftermath was not only in ceremony, but in memory. Memory of a forest where one soldier held back an army. Inestiscund and Devon. Silvestre Herrera never saw himself as a hero. To him, he had only done what had to be done. When asked later why he risked his life so recklessly, he spoke simply, "Before I couldn't side. Let my friends die. If I had to die for them, then I would, Ispel." But history remembers. Herrera's stand was not just an act of bravery. It was a testament to the enduring truth of war, that in the darkest moments, it is often the courage of one that saves the many. His defiance against impossible odds remains one of the most extraordinary individual acts of the Second World War. For his comrades, his sacrifice meant life. For his nation, it became a symbol of unity, a Mexican-born soldier, not yet a U.S. citizen, giving everything for the country that would later embrace him as its own. His story reminds us that valor knows no borders, no language, no distinction of birth. It belongs to humanity itself. In remembering Silvestre Herrera, we do more than honor a soldier. We honor the truth that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide the outcome, and that even in warship's darkest hour, one act of defiance can echo across history. This has been Echoes of WWII. Until next time, remember their sacrifice and carry their stories forward.